The caregiver archetype, selfless love. In this video, we're going to be exploring the shadow and light traits of the caregiver archetype. We're going to be exploring what makes the caregiver archetype so compassionate, empathic, and generous, and some of the challenges that the caregiver archetype can have, some of the shadow traits, some of its vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and what the caregiver archetype can teach humanity, particularly at this point. So we're going to unlock the deep love, compassion, and generosity of the selfless mother and nurturer through the caregiver archetype. Now, what we often think the caregiver archetype looks like, when we tend to think about the caregiver archetype, we tend to think the mother archetype, the nurturer, and we think about the mother's unconditional love for the child, the mother's unconditional love for their family, and even the grandmother archetype, it can come into that as well, this family aspect of caring and nurturing the family. We can also think of the caregiver archetype as those who have caregiving roles, are also carers, the helpers. And we think of therapists, we think about nurses, those in the medical profession, even healers, therapists, this type of thing. And even though that is, when we look at many people that are very strong caregiver archetypes, they often fall into these categories. And that doesn't automatically mean that people that are in these roles, that's their most dominant, but it's often very high. They have certain tendencies, really strong tendencies towards that archetype. But when we look at the caregiver archetype from a specific level, if we go a bit deeper and we look at the caregiver archetype from a collective point of view, we can actually look at the caregiver as, if you think about Mother Earth provides, nurtures, sustains, and can provide, if you think about Mother Nature, can provide protection, safety. We get fed through Mother Nature. We are born in many ways through Mother Nature, and we can provide all of the elements that are in the earth can help us provide shelter and safety and protection. So Mother Earth gives us that. And also when we think about anyone who is creating or nurturing a project or growing, like as we see in the picture, growing a plant from seed, there is a certain amount of nurturing, right? So if a plant or seed is nurtured in the right way, it has the right elements around, it will grow. If it's not, it can feel like it's not going to thrive. And every sort of project that we have, the caregiver aspect to it is when we bring the caregiver traits in, that supports and helps nurture. And the caregiver element is also that reach in a hand, that connection, where just that emotion of love, that ability to be and have that empathy and compassion and be with someone, support them. And it comes from an emotional. So the caregiver archetype is very emotional. And we see in the next picture that the hug, the empathy, the compassion, the warmthness, again, this represents, when we think about empathy, compassion, and a warm nature, that ability to give other people or those that we love that compassion, empathy, and warm heart is part of the caregiver archetype. And when we also look at the next picture where we see what appears to be a homeless man, we see that of that humane love, compassion, empathy, and that generosity, open generosity. And the caregiver energy is very much about that. So what can the caregiver archetype, what can it teach us about our gifts and potential? So we can look at this on both levels, at the level and also as individuals. Even if you do not regard yourself as a strong caregiver archetype, we all have elements of the caregiver, and it can teach us a lot about love in humanity, and treating others as we would like to be treated. So the caregiver archetype is all about care, all about compassion, empathy, and in many ways a dedication to other humans, being dedicated enough, committed enough to other people that they have other people's interests at heart, right? Their generosity, you often find that people that are very strong caregivers got big hearts, and they tend to be generous and sometimes over generous. They don't have a lot of the same attachment to money and things that some other archetypes have. So they tend to be, that's why they're very open and they're helping their over generosity of what they've got. Now, if you think about someone that most people will know that somebody that would give them the coat off their back, often this can go into the caregiver archetype, but again, there can be some shadow elements in that, and we will talk about that. Now, the caregiver archetype is often not really associated with integrity, but particularly in relation to integrity of making sure that they are particularly in roles. If you think about caregiving roles and roles where they work in a helping or even healing profession, where they're doing things with the deepest integrity, because they want what is genuinely best for the client. And that when we embody the caregiver archetype as healers or therapists or coaches or counsellors, we all have that in mind. And when we're doing our ethics for a business, it's all about making sure what's in the best interest of the client, right? If you think about person-centered approaches, there's that element. And it's all about love, it's about nurturing, it's about open-heartedness, it's about being protective towards those that you're helping or supporting, not about taking advantage. It's about safety. So if we think about one of the things that I know in business, many people that are strong caregivers, I have, a very strong caregiver. That's, one of my most strong archetypes. And that protectiveness and safety is very paramount in therapists and healers and coaches that do that. And it can show up in different ways. And it often shows up in that they tend to do a lot longer and deeper training. They tend not to skimp on training and courses because they have a deep awareness of making sure that who they're supporting or helping, that they're doing it right. They're not going to be the rebels and the risk takers. And they're not as much like the opportunists. They're more about making sure that they're doing everything right and that they're doing everything with that level of integrity and being of service rather than just about money, profit, what they can get out of it. It's not about that. It's about service to others. So there's that selflessness. Okay, now again, that can go into a healthy degree, but that's why the caregiver archetype is associated with being very trustworthy. And in certain areas of work, if you think about medical profession, caring and things, a lot of caregivers go into these areas because that's what they do. Now, they can, some of the shadow can creep up in that. But if we understand that that's what the caregiver represents, and if we look at in humanity, what can that teach us? If we bring more care, compassion, empathy, love, nurturing, all these qualities and generosity and selfness, if we all brought that into the earth, we shift the vibration. But the problem is we all can feel in the shadow and we can reflect and attract a lot of the shadow. So what it teaches us is that about love, genuine wanting what's best for everyone, right? And in that energy, it can really support us. But let's look at some of the shadow elements that can cause some challenges. So what can the caregiver archetype teach us about our shadow and the shadow of the caregiver particularly? Well, one of the most common shadow elements that can show up in most caregivers is burnout. This being of so much service to others and the selflessness to an unhealthy degree, especially when someone doesn't know their own boundaries. We see this very strongly in empaths, because most empaths are very strong in the caregiving traits. So they tend to give without thinking, and they're far more aware of other people's emotional needs and wins. So they're more likely to suffer from burnout. But there's also this codependency issue where they think they're helping other people, and they want to help everyone, and often that helping can create codependency in those. It can be family members, it can be your children, it can be friends. Well, what happens by you trying to help them and care for them, you actually you don't allow them to take self-responsibility for the actions, and you create a dependency on you. So you're not allowing them to live their lessons, and you may mother them, or you may try and fix things or get them out of a hole or feel sorry for them, when actually they're not taking self-responsibility for actions or inactions. Another one is compassion fatigue, and that's where, burnout can, one of the reasons for burnout. But this compassion fatigue where you be very compassionate, but you've got nothing else to give. And that's again with a selfless, not knowing where your own boundaries are. And sometimes then when compassion is not really coming from the right vibration, you're not in your power, you're not grounded, you're not centered, you're not even maybe in alignment with your work or your purpose or your life. That can create compassion fatigue, and it can create empathy fatigue. And when we think about the empath, when it is an unruly empath or unhealthy empath, the empath takes on the pain, the suffering, the responsibility of other people's stuff when it's not their stuff to carry, right? And the empath can struggle to disentangle and almost identify and discern what is their energy and what is someone else's. And this is why one of the things I would say about caregiver archetypes and empath archetypes, one of the things that I would say really helped me a lot was learning lots of different types of spiritual and healing techniques. And not from them being as a modality, but building more confidence and having better energetic awareness. So being able to identify the different types of energy and being more acutely aware, by doing that, one of the things that helped me with was recognize and become more confident about recognizing different vibrations and energy. And the more also, one of the even before that, I would say, is deep meditation. I studied meditation now for over what's nearly 35 years, and I studied many different types of meditation. I also have some quite advanced types of meditation I tend to teach on my advanced courses. But one of the things that I found was that meditation, when you get into deep states of meditation, more still, the more you can be more still and calm, it's easier to be more discerning and energetically aware and intuitively aware of the energy around you and the energy within you. So the more that we can move into alignment with ourselves within our own energy field, recognize what's ours, what's not, and get into stillness, we find it far more easier to be discerning what is right for us and also where we may be taking on something that's not ours to support or help. So this is really, really important. And it can also help with recognizing when you're being really manipulated by someone. We're often people where they would like some help from you, and you want to help, but empaths and caregivers can get very easily manipulated by other people who want to be victims and who don't, as I said, with this codependency, but also because you're more energetically aware and you're more likely to help, you can be taking advantage. And this is really important if you run a business, because this can become a big problem for caregivers and empaths. For some reason, energetically, many people sense the caregiver and the empath energy and are more likely to manipulate them or do things to take advantage of them. And the caregiver archetype has to work on their own power, their own sovereignty, and valuing themselves, not seeing themselves as more of a servant or to sacrifice themselves from other people, particularly in business, to be valued, to be honoured, to focus on attracting the audience that are going to value and respect them and remunerate them. They don't want to take advantage. So this is really important, because the caregiver archetype tends to be overgenerous, and that's not always a bad thing in business. There's some things. I've always given a lot of freebies, which has really helped me, for example, build up a good email list. But I also learned sometimes there were some things I really shouldn't have gave away for free. And it's a learning curve. So it's knowing when to be generous and when not to be, right? And that's a huge thing to consider and think about. Now, another thing that I would say is the martyrdom, is recognizing where you're falling into martyrdom or rescuer traits. So martyrdom, you can become a martyr to your own even purpose. You can become a martyr in your family. You can become a martyr in life. And with that comes a lot of can really, you can start creating a lot of health issues. You can believe that you're doing things for the greater good, but that can be a lot of shadow elements. It can also be a lot to do with self-worth, self-esteem. And being a martyr for someone else or being a martyr for other people is not a good example of a good nurturing mother role. If you think about it, if you're a martyr in your family, you're a martyr for your children, you're not going to teach them about respect, honour and value, and they will not honour you as a mother. So this is where we recognise it. And if you rescue people, you constantly rescue them. You're not helping them grow up. You're actually babying them in many ways, and you are not, in many ways, not thinking that they're capable of rescuing themselves. So it's really important to recognise that. And that's where the martyrdom, the self-sacrifice, right? When you sacrifice yourself, sacrifice maybe your business, or sacrifice your finances, sacrifice your time for other people that do not value it, and who are maybe just using you to get what they want at that point, then there's not a valid exchange of energy, particularly if you're not in your power, because you're not in your power when you're doing that, right? Now, the unbounded, lots of these things happen I've talked about is because the caregiver who hasn't set or hasn't learned to create healthy boundaries. So when a caregiver has no boundaries, it's like free reign, and that's like an empath. An empath is no boundaries. It's energetic, anybody's. It's like almost like I'm anybody's, which opens the doors to almost anything. And it can open the doors to disrespect. It can open the doors to all sorts of energetic manipulation. And it's fine when you're in your power. And we all have times in our life when we're not in our power. We all have times when we're not in our light, right? We all have days. So this is where, setting boundaries is really, really important. And for some caregivers and empaths, that's a big challenge for lots of reasons. And it's something that has to be worked on. Another thing is the victim is very strong in the victim archetype. Now, the problem with the caregiver and even the empath is they can be so If we think about the nature and nurture aspect of archetypes, archetypes are formed, I believe, from an element of our nature and how we're nurtured or how we evolve and grow, right? And I think there is lots of traits that we come in at a soul level, that's my opinion, just for a part of what we're here to do and part of our purpose. But there's also, if you think about our conditioning, the family that we've been brought up in, the environment, the culture, our education, different life experiences, they all can shape aspects of how strong certain archetypal patterns are. And the problem with the empath and the caregiver is that the caregiver and the empath can so easily give their power over to everybody else trying to help them. They're not fixing themselves, they're too busy trying to fix everyone else, but also so aware of other people's needs that form that they lose their power, they leak power, and they become the victim because other people recognize that. And if we look at narcissistic behavior, now it's easy to target everything as being a narcissist, but it's sometimes just some people have got more narcissistic traits than others. And what we've got to recognize, we all have traits of almost everything, and it's just depending on the circumstances we find ourselves, how strongly things are, and different things. But if we think about from that perspective, how much a narcissist, for example, if you take it to the extreme level of someone who would be classed as very narcissistic, they almost see the empath, they can recognize the archetypal energy patterns, they recognize they're easy bait, they're easy to manipulate, and they're easy to get what they want. And in some ways, the caregiver. So they're more likely to be the victim of that. They're also more likely to be the victim of their codependent traits, their rescue, their martyr traits, and their overgenerosity. So, and that can be linked to self-worth and self-esteem, and they become then poor me. Now, if you think about the wounded healer, we often think about the wounded healer as the healer that the whole reason someone becomes a healer is because of their own wounding. And then out of that wounding comes the compassion, the empathy and the ability to support and heal others, particularly when someone has resolved something that with their own pain or their desire to help others because there was no one there to support them. The thing is that every wounded healer still has wounds. Every single one of us are not fully healed, and because we all have wounding, we all have different types of challenges. Some people, the wounding is more obvious. That doesn't mean it's more in them than what it is in you. Sometimes it's just more obvious. It's like when you see someone with a physical illness, there can be elements that you might think that that's a wounding, right? And that might be able to be visible. But lots of types of wounding are not visible to the naked eye, but they can be far more damaging. And one of the things is that when we're not completely in the heart, we're not in a complete state of compassion, empathy, and a lot of the qualities that the caregiver teaches us in that state of love, we can actually do more harm than good as wounded healers, because we can want to, again, be the fixer, the rescuer. We think we are a healer and it's our gifts. And what I mean by that is that it's you, the power, not the person doesn't have the power. So you disempower that individual in some way, or you think you're here to heal the world. You see this a lot of times with a lot of young healers when they first start out in their first few years, and sometimes they even could go their first 5 years till they have a lot of lessons, and think that they've done a certain modality, learn a certain approach, and then suddenly they're there to heal and help everyone with that particular problem. They don't have, maybe, I'm not saying everyone, but there is some that have, they're so passionate, which is great, and they have this energy to support, but sometimes, the ego gets in the way, and they don't have discernment to recognise that not everybody that has a particular challenge is their ideal client, for example, and they're not here to help everyone. And they can push themselves on other people and also almost say, well, if you're not willing, if you don't want this, I used to see this. So one of the healing modalities, one of the very first one was Reiki. And one of the things that I noticed was everyone pushing on everyone to send them healing without someone's requesting, and almost saying, well, they don't really want to get healed. If they don't want my healing. Now, just because someone doesn't want your type of healing or wants you to send that does not mean that they don't want to be healed. That's have a very distorted view, and there is so many teachings within the healing and spiritual community that sometimes can cause problems. And this is why the caregiver archetype in its light has discernment, and it has more maturity. It has that motherly awareness that it sees beyond and is there from a state of compassion and empathy first, rather than a mother in its power is there for the children but doesn't overprotect or over rescue or over try to control or manipulate or over do things in a kind of manipulative way. So this is what the caregiver archetype can teach us a lot about as individuals, and even as healers, as therapists, as counselors, as helpers, as mothers, and also as the collective, as being more compassionate, more empathic, and more loving as individuals and as the collective. Now, if you would like to learn more about some of these, like the caregiver archetype or some of the archetypes, I will be sharing more in a link below, including my Introduction to Archetypes, a free course. But also, if you're a strong caregiver and you think that is, one of your main dominant or the main dominant archetype of your business, your brand, and you, how you work, I'm going to share a link below to my Caregiver Brand Archetype course, and I'll also give you access to a free quiz that helps you identify if that is, your most dominant archetype. Go also but with your own intuition. And some other resources I'll put in the description before. But remember, the biggest thing the caregiver teaches us in the positive element is that treat others they would like to be treated, and that selfless love, which really humanity, if we all can reach that level of humanity and a bigger level, the world's a better place, and we all exchange that energy. We're not coming from fear, we're coming from love. And that's what the caregiver archetype can teach us. But it also has to come from, and this is so important, it has to come from a place of deep love for yourself. If you do not love yourself, if you cannot, like in many ways, mother yourself and give yourself the same self-compassion and love and empathy, and you're not in your sovereign power as a mother or a caregiver or a nurturer, an empath, you'll fall in the shadow. You'll lead to also, some of these shadows, or some of these shadows might already show up. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If there's any questions that you have in relation to this video or any aha moments, please do not be shy about leaving a comment below. And I'm also open, as I said, to any questions or subjects that you would like me to talk about. Have a wonderful day. Make sure that if you enjoyed this video, you like, comment, subscribe, and even share. Bye-bye.